The sound of laughter echoed through the pristine corridors of the Galactic Defense Academy, but it wasn't the kind that brought joy. It was sharp, cutting, and directed at one person, Marcus Chen, the only human in a class of 47 cadets from across the galaxy. "Did you see him in gravity training today?" Zektar's forearms gestured wildly as he spoke to his cluster of friends near the dining hall. The reptilian saurian's scales shimmered with amusement. "The human nearly collapsed when we increased the gravity to just 1. 8G, that's barely above his homeworld's pathetic 1.0. A chorus of clicks and whistles erupted from the group, the universal sound of alien laughter. Vexilani, a crystalline being from Kepler 442b, added her melodic but mocking voice to the mix. "On my world, we consider 2.5G a gentle breeze. How did such a fragile species even qualify for the academy?" Marcus sat alone at a corner table, picking at his nutrient paste while trying to ignore the conversation happening just loud enough for him to hear every word. His hands were still shaking slightly from the morning's brutal training session. The gravity chamber had been merciless, and he'd been the first to tap out. Again. "Maybe they admitted humans out of pity," suggested Korth, a gaseous being whose form shifted constantly within his containment suit. "Their planet barely has any decent predators. No wonder they're so soft." The familiar burn of shame crept up Marcus's neck. He'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times since arriving at the academy 6 months ago. Earth had only recently joined the Galactic Coalition, and humans were still proving themselves worthy of inclusion in the elite military training program. But what stung most was the kernel of truth in their words. Compared to most species here, humans did seem fragile. The Academy's standard gravity training routinely reached levels that would crush a human within minutes. The combat simulations involved forces that could tear apart a human body. Even the basic endurance courses would kill most Earth athletes. "At least he tries," came a new voice. Thaneka, a tall, ethereal being from a high-gravity moon, approached the group. Her species, the Valdari, were known for their honor-bound culture. Struggling against one's limitations takes a form of courage. Zektar's tail lashed dismissively. Courage? More like stupidity. He's going to get someone killed when we're deployed. I wouldn't want him watching my back in a real fight. Marcus's fork clattered against his tray. The dining hall fell silent as every eye turned to him. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the metal floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. "Something to say, human?" Zektar's vertical pupils narrowed to slits. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Just wondering if you'd all like to join me for a light hike tomorrow. Nothing too strenuous, just a walk in my homeworld's pathetic gravity." The silence stretched like a taut wire. Then Zektar threw back his reptilian head and laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "A hike? In Earth's gravity? That's not training, that's vacation." "Then it should be easy for you," Marcus replied, his voice level. "We can use the holographic training chamber. I'll program a simple trail from my home region. Just a casual 10-kilometer walk through some hills." Vexilani's crystalline form chimed with amusement. 10 kilometers? In 1.0 G? I could do that in my sleep." "Then you accept?" The challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud. Marcus could see the wheels turning in their alien minds. To refuse would be to admit uncertainty. To accept would be to participate in what they clearly saw as a joke. "Fine," Zektar said finally. "But when you collapse after the first kilometer, I don't want to hear any excuses about how hard it is." "Deal," Marcus said. He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and bring extra water. You'll need it." As he walked away, the laughter resumed behind him, but it sounded different now, less certain, tinged with something that might have been curiosity. What none of them knew was that Marcus Chen hadn't just grown up on Earth. He'd grown up in the Colorado Rockies, where his father had been a mountain rescue specialist and his mother a wilderness survival instructor. Where 10 kilometers wasn't a hike, it was a warm-up, and tomorrow, they were all going to learn exactly what light meant to a human who'd spent his childhood chasing mountain goats across terrain that would make most aliens weep. The real question wasn't whether they could handle Earth's gravity. It was whether they could handle what humans had learned to do in it. The holographic training chamber hummed to life at 600 hours, its walls dissolving into the rugged landscape of Colorado's Front Range. Marcus stood in the center of the room, breathing in air that smelled of pine and snow, watching his homeworld sun paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Atmospheric composition locked, the computer announced in its neutral tone. Gravity set to 0.98 G, Earth standard. Temperature 4 degrees Celsius. Humidity 68%. Marcus smiled. Perfect hiking weather. The chamber door hissed open and his classmates filed in, 12 of them all eager to prove their superiority. They wore standard academy exercise gear, designed to adapt to various atmospheric conditions. Marcus wore something different. Worn hiking boots, layered clothing, and a backpack that looked like it had seen actual use. Is that your equipment? Sektar examined Marcus's gear with obvious disdain. It looks primitive. It's functional, Marcus replied, adjusting the straps of his pack. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Korth's gaseous form swirled impatiently within his containment suit. Can we begin this charade? I have actual training to complete today. Of course. Marcus gestured toward the trail that wound up into the simulated mountains. The path is clearly marked. We'll follow it for 5 kilometers up, then 5 kilometers back down. Simple. Vexilani's crystalline structure caught the artificial sunlight as she examined the terrain. This appears to be standard Class 2 terrain. Minimal obstacles, gentle inclines. Are you certain this represents your species' idea of challenging exercise? I said it was a light hike, Marcus reminded her. Though I should mention, the trail gains about 800 meters of elevation over the 5 kilometers up. Several aliens exchanged glances. Elevation gain meant steeper terrain, but in such low gravity, it hardly seemed threatening. Pathetic, muttered Corvin, a heavily muscled being from a world where standard gravity was 3.2 G. My species' young complete such trials as part of basic education. Then let's begin, Marcus said. He started up the trail at what appeared to be a casual walking pace. The group followed, chatting among themselves about the quaint nature of human challenges. For the first kilometer, everything seemed to confirm their expectations. The gravity was laughably low, the air was rich with oxygen, and the terrain, while rocky, presented no serious obstacles. This is almost pleasant, Taneka commented, her long legs easily covering the distance. I can see why humans might consider this recreational. But by the second kilometer, the casual conversations had begun to fade. The trail had grown steeper, winding back and forth across the face of an increasingly imposing slope. What had looked like gentle hills from the valley floor revealed themselves to be serious mountains as they climbed higher. The incline is becoming more significant, noted Zendra, a mathematical being who calculated everything in precise measurements. Current gradient, approximately 12 degrees increasing. Marcus maintained his steady pace, seemingly unaffected by the growing steepness. His breathing remained controlled, his movements economical. Behind him, some of the aliens were beginning to show signs of strain. How much farther? Sektar's question came out slightly breathless. The Saurian's forearms were working harder now, and his scales had lost some of their earlier shimmer. 3 kilometers to go, Marcus called back cheerfully. We're making good time. The 3rd kilometer changed everything. The trail switchbacked aggressively up a face of loose rock and exposed granite. The footing became treacherous. Loose stones that shifted underfoot, hidden roots that caught unwary ankles. Sections where the path disappeared entirely and had to be navigated by following cairns marking the route. This is not a walking path, Vexilani gasped, her usually melodic voice strained. This is technical climbing terrain. Just scrambling, Marcus called back. Watch your footing on the loose scree. But it wasn't just the terrain that was defeating them. It was the cumulative effect of fighting Earth's gravity for hour after hour, step after step. While their bodies struggled to adapt to atmospheric conditions their species had never evolved for. Corvin, despite his impressive muscle mass, was sweating profusely. His homeworld's high gravity had given him tremendous strength, but it had also given him a body designed for short bursts of power, not sustained endurance. This low oxygen environment is affecting my performance, he wheezed. Low oxygen? Marcus looked puzzled. We're only at about 2,400 meters. The air's pretty thick here compared to where I usually hike. The 4th kilometer nearly broke them. The trail led across a series of exposed ridges where the wind cut through their clothing like knives. The path was barely a meter wide in places, with steep drops on either side that made even the bravest aliens pause. But worse than the exposure was the relentless nature of the climb itself. Human endurance, Marcus was beginning to realize, was something no other species in the Academy truly understood. They were stronger, faster, more resilient in many ways, but they had never developed the peculiar human ability to simply keep going long after their bodies screamed for rest. How are you not tired? Korth's gaseous form had contracted within his suit, conserving energy. Marcus paused to take a drink from his water bottle, the same casual drink he'd been taking every 20 minutes since they started. Tired? We're just getting warmed up. The really fun part is the descent. Behind him, 12 of the galaxy's supposedly superior beings stared at him in growing horror. What had they gotten themselves into? The 5th kilometer destroyed every assumption the alien cadets had ever made about humans. The trail to the summit became a vertical labyrinth of granite slabs and narrow ledges. What Marcus casually called a bit of scrambling required the use of hands as well as feet, pulling oneself up over boulders the size of small buildings and navigating passages so narrow that some of the larger aliens couldn't fit through without removing equipment. "This is not hiking," Zektar gasped, his forearms trembling as he hauled himself over another granite outcrop. "This is mountaineering. Advanced mountaineering." Marcus glanced back with what might have been genuine confusion. "Really? This is just the standard approach to most peaks in my area. We used to bring school groups up here." He paused, considering. "Though usually we'd take the easier route on the north face for the kids. This is the easier route?" The thought rippled through the group like a shockwave. Vexilani had gone completely silent, her crystalline form dimmed with exhaustion. Each step sent hairline fractures through her structure, not from the low gravity but from the constant vibration and impact of scrambling over uneven terrain for hours. Her species had evolved in the stable, predictable environment of crystal caves. This chaos of loose rock and unpredictable surfaces was her nightmare. "I need to rest," she finally admitted, the words coming out like broken glass. Marcus stopped immediately. "Of course. There's a good ledge about 50 meters ahead with some wind protection." As the group collapsed onto the rocky shelf, Marcus remained standing, seemingly unaffected by the 4 hours of climbing that had nearly destroyed some of the galaxy's elite cadets. He pulled out his water bottle and took another measured drink, then began pointing out features of the landscape below. "You can see the trail we came up pretty clearly from here," he said conversationally. "And that valley over there leads to some really nice lakes if you want to add another day to the hike." Corvin stared at him in disbelief. The heavily muscled alien was sprawled on the rocks, his body shaking with exhaustion. "Another day? You mean there are longer versions of this torture?" "Oh sure, this is just a day hike. The really fun stuff starts when you get into multi-day traverses. I once spent 3 weeks crossing the Rockies with just what I could carry." Marcus's eyes took on a distant look. Now that was a good trip. Thanica, whose honor-bound culture had kept her going long past the point of reasonable endurance, finally asked the question they were all thinking. "How are you doing this? You're from a low-gravity world. Your species is supposed to be fragile." Marcus settled onto a rock beside them, and for the first time since they'd started, he looked serious. "You know what you all got wrong? You assumed that low gravity meant easy living. You figured that because Earth doesn't have crushing gravity or toxic atmospheres or extreme weather, humans must have had it easy." He gestured toward the landscape around them. "But look at this place. Really look at it." The aliens followed his gaze, and for the first time they began to see the environment as something other than a simple obstacle course. The mountains stretched in every direction, a wilderness of stone and wind and vertical challenges that seemed to go on forever. And somewhere in that vast landscape, humans had not just survived, they had thrived. "Earth doesn't have extreme gravity," Marcus continued, "but it has every other extreme you can imagine. Deserts where the temperature hits 50 degrees Celsius, mountains that scrape the sky, oceans that can swallow continents, weather that can kill you in 100 different ways." Korth's form stirred weakly within his containment suit. "But the gravity doesn't matter when you're hanging off a cliff face in a snowstorm," Marcus said quietly. "It doesn't matter when you're crossing a desert with no water for 3 days. It doesn't matter when you're navigating by stars across an ocean that wants to kill you. He stood up and shouldered his pack. Humans didn't get strong by fighting high gravity. We got strong by refusing to quit, by pushing forward when everything in our bodies told us to stop, by figuring out how to keep going when going seemed impossible. The silence that followed was profound. The summit's just ahead, Marcus said finally. You can see the whole range from there. It's worth the last push. One by one, the alien cadets stood. Their bodies protested, their muscles screamed, their minds reeled with exhaustion. But something in Marcus's words, something in the casual way he assumed they would continue, made stopping unthinkable. They reached the summit 20 minutes later. The view from the top revealed a landscape that took their breath away. Not from exertion this time, but from pure awe. Mountains stretched to every horizon, peak after peak disappearing into the distance, and carved into that wilderness were hundreds of trails, a network of paths that represented thousands of years of humans walking these mountains just for the joy of being there. This is what you do for fun? Zector asked, his voice hushed. Marcus nodded. Every weekend if we can manage it. But as they stood there, breathing hard and staring out at the endless wilderness, each alien cadet was beginning to understand something that would change how they saw humans forever. This wasn't just exercise. This wasn't just recreation. This was training. This was what every human child grew up doing, what every human adult did to relax, what humans considered normal physical activity, and they were only halfway done. So, Marcus said cheerfully, shouldering his pack once again. Ready for the fun part? 12 aliens stared at him in dawning horror. Fun part? Vexilani's voice cracked like breaking crystal. Marcus grinned. The descent. Going down is where things get interesting. The first kilometer down proved that everything the aliens thought they knew about physics was wrong. How is going down harder than going up? Corvin demanded, his powerful legs shaking as he tried to control his descent on the loose scree slope. Marcus, somehow managing to move with the same fluid grace he'd shown climbing up, called back over his shoulder. Different muscles. Going up, you're just fighting gravity. Going down, you're fighting gravity, momentum, and inertia all at once. The trail had transformed from a climbing challenge into something far more sinister, a test of balance, coordination, and the kind of muscle control that no other species had ever needed to develop. Each step down the rocky slope threatened to turn into an uncontrolled slide. Each boulder required careful navigation to avoid momentum that could send them tumbling into the valley below. This is impossible, Korth gasped, his gaseous form compressed tight with stress. How do you control your descent rate on such unstable terrain? Marcus paused to let the group catch up, seemingly unaware that he'd been practically dancing down sections that were causing the others to inch forward in terror. You don't fight it. You work with it. Let the mountain tell you where to go. But it wasn't just the technical challenge that was breaking them. It was the realization of what this meant about human physiology and psychology. Zector, whose species had evolved under high-gravity conditions that made them incredibly strong but ponderous, was beginning to understand why humans moved the way they did. Your entire musculature is designed for this, isn't it? For constant adjustment, constant adaptation to changing conditions. I suppose, Marcus said, helping Vexilani navigate around a particularly treacherous section where the trail disappeared entirely. We're persistence hunters originally. We evolved to chase prey across any terrain for as long as it took. The implications hit them like a thunderbolt. You're pursuit predators, Thanica breathed. Not ambush predators or pack hunters. You literally chase things until they die of exhaustion. Marcus nodded casually. Pretty much. Humans can outrun almost any animal on Earth given enough distance. We just keep going until they can't. The group fell silent, processing this revelation as they continued their trembling descent. They were beginning to understand that they hadn't just underestimated human physical capabilities. They had fundamentally misunderstood what humans were. By the 3rd kilometer down, the pretense of this being a casual activity had completely evaporated. Several of the aliens were moving purely on willpower, their bodies pushed far beyond anything they had experienced in the Academy's brutal training programs. I don't understand, Zendra calculated through gritted teeth. This shouldn't be more difficult than our 3G combat simulations. It's not about the gravity, Marcus explained, stopping to let them rest again. It's about duration and complexity. Your combat sims last 30 minutes in controlled conditions. We've been moving for 6 hours across constantly changing terrain. He gestured back up the mountain they'd descended. Every step has been different. Every placement of your foot required a micro-decision about balance, pressure, angle of approach. Your nervous systems aren't designed for that kind of sustained complex processing. Corvin looked up at him with something approaching respect. What is your nervous system designed for? Marcus considered the question seriously. Improvisation, adaptation, endurance, humans aren't specialized for any one environment. We're specialized for figuring out how to survive in whatever environment we find ourselves in. As if to demonstrate his point, the trail ahead disappeared into a creek crossing where the spring snowmelt had washed away the bridge. Marcus studied the situation for about 30 seconds, then began hopping across the wet rocks with the same casual confidence he'd shown all day. The current's not too bad, he called back. Just test each rock before you commit your weight to it. What followed was 20 minutes of the most terrifying stream crossing any of them had ever attempted. Not because of the water, barely knee-deep, but because it perfectly illustrated the fundamental difference between human and alien problem-solving. The aliens tried to plan each move, to calculate the optimal path, to minimize risk through careful analysis. They failed repeatedly, slipping into the icy water, losing their balance, overthinking every step. Marcus had simply looked at the situation, identified a workable solution, and executed it without hesitation. When his first route proved suboptimal, he'd adapted instantly, finding another path with no apparent stress or concern. You don't plan, do you? Vexilani asked as they regrouped on the far side of the creek, most of them soaked and shivering. I plan, Marcus said, wringing out his socks. But I don't overplan. Plans change. The mountain doesn't care what you planned. The final 2 kilometers nearly broke them entirely. The trail descended through sections that could generously be called controlled falling, steep. Slopes of loose rock where the only way down was to let gravity help, while somehow maintaining enough control to avoid disaster. Marcus moved through these sections like water flowing downhill, while the aliens struggled with every step. This is not recreational activity, Zektar stated flatly as they reached the bottom. This is advanced tactical training disguised as leisure. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. Really, I always found it relaxing. The word hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they understood about stress, difficulty, and recreational activities. As they stood in the valley where they'd started 8 hours earlier, the alien cadets looked back up at the mountain they'd just descended. In the growing twilight, the peaks looked impossibly high, the trail impossibly complex, and somewhere up there humans went for casual walks on weekends. The Academy needs to know about this, Thanica said quietly. Human endurance capabilities have been drastically underestimated. Marcus shrugged, already packing his gear with the efficient motions of someone who'd done this thousands of times. It's just hiking. Nothing special. But as the holographic chamber powered down around them, 12 of the galaxy's supposedly superior beings stood in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand what human really meant. They had come to mock Earth's weak gravity. Instead, they had discovered a species that had turned that weak gravity into the foundation of capabilities that made them the most terrifying endurance predators the galaxy had ever seen. And tomorrow, they would have to return to their regular training, knowing that the fragile human in their class was probably taking it easy on himself just to keep up with their far more limited abilities. The real question wasn't how humans had qualified for the Galactic Defense Academy. The question was how anyone else had. Epilogue. The New Understanding. 6 months later, the dining hall of the Galactic Defense Academy buzzed with a different kind of energy. Marcus Chen still sat at his usual table, but now he wasn't alone. Tell us about the time your family crossed that desert, Zektar requested, settling his four-armed bulk onto the chair across from Marcus. The Saurian's tone held none of its former mockery, only genuine curiosity. Which desert? Marcus asked, looking up from his meal. There are several good stories. The one where you ran out of water, Vexilani chimed in, her crystalline form reflecting the ambient light as she joined them. Over the months, she had learned to modulate her structure to reduce stress fractures during the increasingly popular human-style training sessions. The group around Marcus had grown. What had started as 12 aliens learning a humbling lesson had evolved into something unprecedented in the Academy's history: interspecies collaborative training based on human endurance principles. So we're 3 days into crossing the Mojave, Marcus began, settling into storyteller mode, and my dad realizes we calculated our water consumption wrong. Around the dining hall, other conversations were taking place that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Alien cadets were discussing hiking boots, debating the merits of different trail foods, and planning weekend adventures in the holographic chambers. But the real changes ran deeper than recreational activities. Commander Voss High, a veteran of 17 different conflicts, reviewed the latest Academy training reports with growing amazement. Human-inspired endurance protocols had been integrated into standard curricula after initial resistance from traditional instructors. The results were undeniable. Cadet performance in sustained operations had improved by an average of 340%. Mission failure rates in extended duration scenarios had dropped to near zero. Most remarkably, interspecies cooperation had reached unprecedented levels as cadets learned to work together through challenges that pushed them all beyond their individual limitations. The humans have changed everything, Vosshai noted in her report to Academy Command. Not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through a fundamental redefinition of what constitutes normal physical and mental capability. The changes extended beyond the Academy. In the wider galaxy, human exploration teams were being requested for previously impossible missions. Planets dismissed as too hostile for colonization were being reconsidered through the lens of human adaptability. Trade routes through challenging space were being established by crews that included humans for their proven ability to maintain performance under sustained stress. Marcus, unaware that his casual invitation to a light hike had sparked a revolution in galactic thinking, was more focused on immediate concerns. Next weekend, I was thinking of trying the Annapurna circuit, he mentioned to his growing circle of friends. It's a bit longer than our usual hikes, about 230 kilometers over 17 days. The silence that greeted this announcement was familiar by now. 230 kilometers? Corvin asked faintly. Over 17 days? Through high-altitude terrain with significant technical challenges, Marcus added helpfully. But the views are supposed to be incredible. 12 alien faces turned to each other with expressions that had become routine over the past months. A mixture of terror, determination, and inexplicable eagerness to discover exactly how much punishment they could endure in the name of human-style recreation. We're in, Thanica said finally, speaking for the group with the kind of resigned courage that had become their trademark. Marcus grinned. Great. Fair warning, though, this one might actually be challenging, as laughter erupted around the table. Real laughter, born of friendship and shared trials rather than mockery. None of them noticed the small crowd of newer cadets gathering nearby, listening with growing fascination to stories of the legendary human and his impossible adventures. The cycle was beginning again. Somewhere in the galaxy, other species were still making assumptions about human fragility, still calculating that Earth's low gravity made its inhabitants soft and weak. They would learn. They always did, usually around kilometer 3 of whatever Marcus Chen considered a light hike, and in the process, they would discover what humans had always known, that strength isn't about the weight you can lift, it's about how far you're willing to carry it. The galaxy was still learning to measure distance the human way, one impossible step at a time. The end.